We'll make copies of the slideshow and get them to council members. We just have received it. It'll be posted on our website for public review after this meeting. Let me just ask you one thing. Mr. Bardini, you said generally a multi-year drought is not a state emergency.
Generally.
I find that puzzling. Explain that if you would.
Yeah, so generally what I mean by that is that the local agencies, between the management plans of the local agencies, generally can address at the local level and hasn't necessarily been asked to be elevated up through their operational areas up to the state OES on average. Now that could change in the past, but typically when you look at the record of historically, typically it was handled at the local level of the shortage, and most of the water agencies and special districts have had the contingencies to manage that.
When is it considered a state emergency?
When it exceeds the local's resources to address it.
So it's not a state emergency except where it is, when it is.
Well, obviously the state is concerned with what's going on at the local level, but as far as the management of actions, generally the locals with their plans and stuff are generally adequate to address multi-years, especially the big ones. However, the only caveat has been these small communities which are problematic.
How does the Department of Water Resources know whether or not local agencies have a capacity that's adequate to meet the challenges they face?
Well, again, when I kind of threw the slides with between the integrated regional water management plans we've been doing, increasing, so it gives us some indication of their portfolios or where they're managing, and their urban management plans. That's for the big agencies. So
but we know from previous written documents from the department and testimony here, the Department of Water Resources does not review the urban water management plans to determine whether or not they're a correct reflection of the facts or whether the agencies are in fact following their own plans. And so you're taking the statements of the agencies on their own, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. In the past drought conditions, your charts summarized X number of counties have done drought emergencies and so on. Did they all do a drought emergency at the same time?
Generally, it depends.
It's scattered all over,
sure.
And it's triggered by local initiative only, except in a few cases where it might be triggered by something else.
Yeah, well, again, going with the history, the kind of stresses we're seeing today is not necessarily indicative. So typically it's come up, we haven't had to do something more at a state level based on a wide scale deficiencies, I would say.
It's hard to avoid the conclusion that there is no state plan itself. It is a compendium of local plans that the state's watching, and you respond, of course, if a local agency would ask for a declaration of an emergency, as governors commonly do. But there is no state trigger for action. Your emergency committee doesn't get formed until folks sit around and decide, well, we ought to form it.
Right. So the only caveat I would say of where we're at on the state level is when we did the drought contingency plan back in 2010 was the effort through the California Water Plan to articulate this. So there is the body of work that frames it, but again, it's like any emergency action plan, like during a flood, essentially you have to play it out based on how it happens on the ground, and then we react as necessary.
Well, a flood is a condition that happens relatively rapidly, and you know theoretically it's coming, but you can't say with absolute certainty. It seems to me dry years tend to give a little earlier notice of what's going on, and certainly the signs for this year have not been good. I'm a little surprised that you're going to wait until next year to form the committee and start contemplating state actions on drought committee. I don't understand why.
Essentially what we did, if you look at the drought contingency plan, there's different levels of what we call where we're at in terms of shortage, and it goes from level 1 to level 5. And I would say right now, if you look at what's going on in the conditions between storage and runoff and where we're seeing where the deficiencies are currently at, is we're kind of at what we call level 2, which is prior to forming the items you're talking about. So again, if it's short and we start getting into this year, then we would move to the next level and then be promoting the things that are kind of outlined in the contingency plan.
Do you think all the local water agencies in California would necessarily agree that local emergencies are not state emergencies?
I would say that I would say that the locals would recognize that they have to go beyond their resources before asking for state support.
Okay. All right. Other questions? Ms. Gray.
Thank you. I apologize for being late this morning. And you may have already answered this question through your discussion with Mr. Eisenberg, but especially in light of the fact that there's no statewide coordination for drought, can you just talk about the effect that drought would have on Southern California? Because your report does not include that. So I'd like to hear your perspective. And again, you may have discussed this in your discussion with Phil, but can you address that?
In terms of like the economic...
From a state perspective, because
Right.
your report does not include that. It's kind of like what
Yeah.
Mr. Eisenberg was saying to you.
Right. So the aspects of exactly what the economic consequences of the shortages, again, with all the special districts and the plans and the urban level plans that they have, management plans, it varies. It varies within the LA basin, depending on their portfolios and elsewhere. So how that will shape as time goes, or the ability to get management actions in terms of where the groundwater is and where the storage is at and where the ability to get transfers, all those things play into different scenarios. So there's a lot of uncertainty to what extent and how far, depending on the weather is and hydrology, has different economic consequences. At general, what I would say is that our history has been that the small community issues become first versus the larger because of the diversification. And generally, it's more the concerns over groundwater management and the agricultural economy that really feels the influence. So our view is that typically what we've seen historically is that the resource plans of the urban areas have handled these in the past. The issue really is where we're at with our larger agricultural economy of the state based on the shortage.
But your report or your efforts are not statewide at this point, just the smaller counties or other areas, and not a statewide effort?
Well, between the California water plans and the RWM plans is our ability of trying to strengthen up the planning efforts to deal with these issues. As I described, the water plan has had the drought contingency plan, and that's an effort that we try to do every 5 years to update that drought contingency plan based on the body of information where we're at. And I agree that are we able to go through thoroughly and pull the data and get all the stuff with the resources that we would like? I don't think anybody has the resources to fully get where we want.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Natoli, then Mr. Fiorini.
Yeah, just a couple of quick, brief questions. Gary, thanks for your presentation. I just want to get a clarification. On one of the slides, you said the reservoir capacity, at least the printed up there, was going to be 76% September. I thought I heard you say 56%, though. So what is...
76. If I said
it is 76.
That's our estimate.
I know it was an estimate. I just wanted to make sure.
I'm going to say I got it from Maury Roos last night, so if it's off, then we're going to go after Maury. But after 50, 60 years, I'll figure Maury has it right.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. The other, I just wanted to you touched on it, and certainly you cited your years of experience and how some of the preparations were made for in anticipating drought periods of 7 years and firm yield and so forth. Could you maybe just take a moment more, talk about, you referenced, some of the loss of flexibility in some of the slides, but, what else has changed or not, I guess, over the 30 years that as you see these cycles, they seem to be becoming more repetitive. We talk about climate change and so forth, but just again, referencing your experience in years, with the department. Just take a moment and just maybe elaborate a little bit anyway.
Well, I mean, if you look at the history, I would say, first of all, the watersheds themselves, if you took the LA, they're getting drier at times and the rainfall's coming more intense. And you're seeing that our runoff pattern is starting to change a little bit from earlier in the spring than what we used to get later in the April, July. So you're seeing a slow trend and change of just runoff, and that has a longer term influence on how a watershed responds in terms of runoff and when you can expect your water. So you have that happening as a low level. The second thing we see is then you end up with a lot of watershed issues because of consequence and fires, et cetera, and mud debris, and that complicates the management. The next thing you're seeing is based on the fact of the reliability of moving water interbasin has been decreasing as time goes on, and I'll leave others to describe that. And then the last thing is that we're seeing, again, this groundwater management. And essentially, I think, you could see we're having some very good overdraft in certain regions, and our ability to continue the practices of that and flexibility are getting less. So I would say, in general, and then of course the last thing I try to bring in the presentation is we've been doing so much conservation, et cetera, which is great, and water use efficiency, but then the ability to take shortage or conservation and those actions we call demand hardening is more increased.
What about storage or lack thereof? I mean, again, you just referenced your 30 years, and either above ground, off stream, underground. How does that play into the ability to have more flexibility and or to guard against some of the drought periods?
Well, I mean, essentially the ability, and I kind of through the slides of our statewide water management activities and regional management activities. At the end of the day, progressing a portfolio of management actions to address the reliability is really important. Storage is an element of that, both groundwater and surface storage. But of course, one of the limiting factors has been the ability to move water out of storage by conveyance. So we have conveyance limitations. But
just my point is, move it out of storage, but how about creation of storage?
Yeah, the thing is though, when we get it into storage, can we actually move it out to the when the demand
affected areas? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Fiorini.
Well, first of all, Gary, the work that you've done for the last many years in helping coordinate Prop 50, Prop 84 funds to integrated regional water management plans has put the state in a better place today than it was several years ago, and being able to be a little more conservation-oriented, a little better water management efficient. So that work is appreciated. I wanted to follow up on a comment you made about storage on the Colorado system. You said dry conditions, but because of the storage that they have, it's not unlikely to be major cutbacks to California. I think what Don was getting at, and what I would like to have a further discussion about, maybe not today, but in the future, is has the California demand for water outgrown our current storage capacity, and do we need to take a look at the 2000 study that you were a part of and revisit some of those 53 sites that were identified as potential storage locations in Northern California, and perhaps helping us to better insulate ourselves against prolonged droughts?
Well, again, I would say storage, as you described, we've looked at it, and what it amounts to is the aspects of being able to get the water from into storage has been one issue, but it's been more, can we get to the beneficial uses from that reservoir? And I think there's been a bit of what's necessary for the environmental protection, and how do we use the additional storage to help improve that, let alone try to improve the reliability. So I think right now, unfortunately, where we're at is we are down to integrated water management where they all touch each other's, and so storage in an absence of discussing its conveyance or other management actions, it's the broad portfolio is what's necessary to meet the challenges we have today.
Well, let's talk about it some other time.
Mr. Bardini, isn't it correct that the federal government has issued an invitation to Colorado River water users for a shortage-related discussion about what near-term steps could be taken to minimize the impact of their problems?
I'm not familiar with that.
The announcement was about two months ago, where they issued an invitation. Several observers were skeptical that anybody would wish to adjust their request for water based on that, but that seems to me to be a relatively positive step of the federal government, which runs the Colorado system, and going in early rather than waiting for the situation to get tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter, and then respond when there is no time to take small actions now that may lead to benefits later. And I'm curious as to why the state would not like to replicate that regarding the state water project.
Yeah, I have to look at so I'm not familiar with Phil, and I'm not sure what the application of what the Bureau is doing versus what we're managing in the state is. So it's something we will look into, and I'll be interested if there's lessons learned there.
Yeah. I mean, although you've said that the state considers a multi-year drought not mostly a state problem, I think for all practical purposes, for the administration, it's impossible to maintain that posture. I do believe that the choices we make as a society on what are regional or localized problems, we ought to prefer regional or localized solutions as opposed to a continuation of grandiose and very expensive things that are supposed to solve everyone's problems for all times. But I don't think the state is going to be able, as time goes on, to step back and say it's not really a state problem till it gets to be a crisis or a near crisis. And it doesn't smack of planning. Because, for example, a small reduction, 2, 3, 4, 5% in demand buys you additional months or years of a system that is stressed. But if you don't start early, then the actual reductions have to be more severe later on. I mean, this is kind of like budgets. If you're spending more than you're bringing in, after a while, the solutions to that problem are draconian and punitive, and so everyone says, "Well, let's ignore that." And it's never made sense to me that the state planning seems to be premised on that. I do understand that most activity in water and wastewater and flood control is local activity. I've got that, but as a planning function, which is in the Department of Water Resources, is the preeminent state planning entity in the water world. It's hard for me to figure that out.
Yeah, my only caveat is even when the locals are struggling with the water reliability, that's a state problem. The question is the response is it a state elevated to a state level? So I just want to be what I was trying to articulate in that slide. So clearly how local agencies can manage it is certainly a state problem. It's the aspects of where it gets elevated up to a state response, to a declaration.
Okay. All right. Other questions? Thank you, Mr. Bordini. Who is next? Jason, are you next?